Okay, thank you very much. Thanks to Jeffrey and to everyone who has facilitated this wonderful event. My name is Dean Irvine, and I'm the director of a project called Editing Modernism in Canada, which has been going on for the past 7 years. I wanted to talk today a little bit about one particular part of that project, which has to do with the digitization and curation of Aboriginal cultural heritage. So one of the things that I wanted to speak to is sort of the ways in which our project migrated toward working on this material and with Aboriginal communities, and to talk about a particular pilot project. So as a research community whose mandate includes the historical period that witnessed devastating effects of imperial modernity on Aboriginal peoples, and that saw the appropriation of Aboriginal cultural goods by non-Aboriginal authors and artists who imported them to modes of modernist primitivism, EMIC, as we call the Editing Modernism in Canada project, has been very self-conscious about not repeating history. According to cultural policy of the early to mid-20th century, Aboriginal art and orature were treated as natural resources. That is, resources to which no individual Indigenous person could make a singular claim, and therefore could be freely colonized and extracted for use by non-Aboriginal ethnographers and creative practitioners. This systematic refusal to recognize Aboriginal artistic production and art and to salvage it instead as ethnography cleared the ground for the indigenization of modernist visual art and literature in Canada. This indigenized modernism, which I call salvage modernism, whose primitivist modes attempted to translate Aboriginal cultural artifacts and knowledges into a modernist aesthetic, ended up furthering the assimilation of Aboriginal cultural heritage into a dominant imperial culture. So, with respect to digitization of Aboriginal literature and orature, I want to recognize that EMIC or any other non-Aboriginal body cannot proceed by interpolating all early to mid-20th century Aboriginal writing in Canada into non-Aboriginal institutions and technologies of Western cultural modernity. In other words, we can't uncritically absorb Aboriginal cultural heritage into a digital commons that is inscribed by narratives of imperial modernity and its technologies. While I'm wholly sympathetic to Len Findley's directive to scholars in Canada to always indigenize, I'm mindful at the same time that what might ironically be construed as EMIC's imperative, always modernize, not become another version of an assimilationist program. Obviously, I don't want to become the Duncan Campbell Scott of my generation who initiates a policy of mass digitization that assimilates the fugitive tax of early to mid-century Aboriginal literatures and art into non-Aboriginal modernism. Instead of throwing open our projects to Aboriginal materials, then, we need to respect and understand the Indigenous conceptions of common cultural heritage, and adopt protocols appropriate to the curation of Aboriginal cultural heritage. We also need to co-develop in partnership with Aboriginal communities appropriate digital technologies that enable productive collaborations and with institutions, companies, and individuals beyond the First Nations. By indigenizing this commons and its potential for collaborative action, we see ourselves moving toward an activist intervention into the digital humanities and its material and ideological investments in technologies of imperial modernity. In adopting practices of Indigenous digital repatriation, that is, practices of restoring cultural heritage to First Nations communities by using participatory computer-based technologies of digitization, transmission, and preservation, we're interested in finding ways to reinitiate and rethink the long history of collaborative exchange between Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal communities on Canada's West Coast through the remediation of manuscripts, printed texts, and audio and filmic recordings. We're also aware of the ambivalence that underwrites the act of collaboration in the historical context of imperial modernity. So much so that by undertaking renegotiated and consensual collaboration with First Nations groups, EMIC is decidedly working toward building a remedial history of Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal communication. Located at the conjuncture of Indigenous knowledges and new media technologies, our digital repatriation initiative allows practitioners to collaborate with First Nations communities to remediate literary and cultural history so that the material and social mediations of Aboriginal or non-Aboriginal communicative exchange can be read anew instead of the impoverished narrative so often decried as one of irremediable loss. We're working to implement participatory strategies of Aboriginal engagement that see First Nations communities actively involved in the curation, remediation, and digital repatriation of their own cultural heritage. Digital repatriation, then, signifies more than some McLuhanite understandings of remediation as the reciprocal relationship between old and new media. It facilitates and participates in the social and political processes attached to the return of Aboriginal cultural heritage and the conservation of traditional knowledges. At the same time, as a project, we're mindful of the putative dark side of the digital humanities, a phenomenon that has attracted controversies and accumulated critical mass, principally constellated by digital race studies and post-colonial digital humanities. Indeed, EMIC's practice of digital repatriation could easily run the risk of crossing over to this dark side were we to adopt a policy of uncritically promoting open access to Indigenous content under the ideologically misaligned intentions of Western notions of cultural property and conceptions of the public domain. With the mass digitization of ethnographic materials collected, translated, and published in the early 20th century, as evidenced by their availability in digital repositories such as Google Books, the Internet Archive, and the Hathi Trust, public domain runs the risk of legislating a new phase of salvage ethnography. And along with the concurrent digitization of indigenized modernist texts in the public domain, the recirculation of salvage ethnography looks to recolonize and expropriate Indigenous cultural heritage in digital media. This understanding of public domain reveals acute blind spots in Western ideas of cultural property, which chronically fail to accommodate non-Western systems of knowledge circulation and preservation. In effect, public domain threatens to reenact early 20th century cultural policy that rendered Indigenous knowledges and art as part of a linguistic and aesthetic commons available for expropriation by non-Aboriginal peoples. Instead of a return to salvage ethnography in the guise of new media then, EMIC is proposing the digital repatriation of Indigenous cultural heritage, not to facilitate open access, but to safeguard traditional knowledges in collaboration with First Nations communities and in observance of the cultural protocols that regulate circulation and preservation. I keep forgetting to advance my slides. Don't do that. One of the things that I just wanted to end on was giving a nod to a project called Mukadu, which is a project that EMIC has been partnered with for several years now. And the Mukadu Collective has developed a flexible system of sharing and access protocols, as well as labels and licenses to protect Aboriginal cultural heritage. It's a Drupal-based content management system that allows users to add and share text, images, audio, and video. It permits users to attach digital objects to digital objects, specific access and sharing protocols, and enable them to decide how to define and circulate content among community members, or to make that content open to the public. Mookadoo is built upon the intellectual property principles of Creative Commons licenses to develop traditional knowledge licenses. These licenses are not copyright licenses, so they don't change existing rights and responsibilities. They're additional agreements that acknowledge that with some material, special rules governing access and use also exist. So one of the things that we've done recently, and this is what I will close with, is to note that we've recently negotiated a memorandum of agreement with Mookadoo's developers to begin working on the integration of their front end with the code base of Emix Digital Repository and Editorial Workbench, not to affect the assimilation of their Aboriginal content management system into our digital repository, which we call the Modernist Commons, but to offer up the open source code of our commons to First Nations communities so that they may begin to participate in the digital repatriation of their own cultural heritage. So instead of dislocating Aboriginal cultural heritage from traditional lands to digitization labs, this partnership will see the implementation of Mookadoo's mobile app that enlists locative mapping technology and permits users to upload content from remote locations, as well as the deployment of Mojo mobile digitization labs. These are signal instances of the transformation and indigenization of digital humanities technologies. Once we have integrated this platform and made it available for release, we'll begin to offer it to Mookadoo's Transnational Digital Aboriginal Network. And in anticipation of that particular moment, I'd like to say thank you for listening to me for this brief period of time, and to look forward to seeing this project come to fruition. Thank you very much.